To think you know Henry VIII is to think of the cliches: the larger-than-life king with 6 wives, the founder of the Church of England, the monarch painted by Hans Holbein with his legs wide, chest out, a man radiating unstoppable authority. That is the version given to us in school books, in portraits, in sanitized dramas, but that mask of majesty conceals a reality so grotesque it almost beggars belief. The truth of Henry VIII is not a story of chivalric splendor, but of a body and mind collapsing into horror. By the end, England was ruled by something more monstrous than majestic, a man whose very flesh became a warning to posterity. Strip away the myth, and you find a king whose existence reads like a dark parable. This was not merely a ruler with a taste for excess. Henry became a grotesque spectacle, his body swelling, his mind unraveling, his paranoia choking the life of his court. Gluttony, cruelty, and decay defined his reign as much as politics or religion. His story forces us to ask, how much of a king's greatness is performance, and how much is a mask hiding rot? In the Europe of the 16th century, Henry's fall was startling. His contemporary, Francis I of France, though often mocked for vanity and extravagance, retained a soldier's vigor until his later years. Emperor Charles V, though tormented by gout and a famously protruding jaw, remained a commanding figure who could abdicate on his own terms. Yet Henry, once the Golden Prince of England, celebrated for his athleticism, music, and hunting, decayed into something unrecognizable. His decline was not just physical but symbolic. Where other monarchs aged into stately weariness, Henry VIII collapsed into a living nightmare. Contemporaries had no language to fully describe what they were witnessing. To many, a king's body was a reflection of divine favor. Strength and beauty signaled God's blessing. Disease and deformity suggested judgment. Henry's failing flesh, his reeking wounds, his corpulent bulk, seemed like an omen. Here was God's anointed sovereign reduced to a spectacle that frightened his own servants. Courtiers whispered in corridors, terrified of both his wrath and his smell. The Tudor myth of power majesty embodied in one man was undone by the grotesque truth that his majesty was falling apart before their eyes. It is no exaggeration to say that by the last decade of his reign, Henry was less a king than a walking corpse. A monarch whose very presence was a reminder of death, decay, and the ruin that unchecked power brings. This is not the Henry of textbooks, but the Henry history tried to hide. And it is here, behind the mask of the king, that our story begins. By the closing years of his reign, Henry VIII's body was no longer the vessel of majesty, but a grotesque burden. His waistline had swollen to an astonishing 54 inches greater than the height of many of his own subjects. Estimates place his weight at nearly 400 pounds, in an age when the average Englishman was a lean 140. He could no longer ride a horse or climb stairs without mechanical assistance. A man once hailed as the most handsome prince in Christendom had become a spectacle of flesh, confined to chairs fitted with pulleys and wheeled contraptions that carted him from chamber to chamber. Yet it was not merely his size that horrified. His legs, once strong from hunting and tournaments, were ravaged by ulcers that refused to heal. These were not scratches but gaping wounds, raw and oozing, swathed in linen that could not contain the smell. Chronic infection gnawed at him. Servants approached with perfumed handkerchiefs, pressed to their noses, and even then some were seen retching. Accounts speak of courtiers detecting his stench from adjoining rooms, long before the king himself entered. To be chosen for the duty of dressing Henry was considered punishment. Men drew straws to decide who would endure the ordeal of standing close enough to fasten his hose and doublet while breathing the fumes of his rotting flesh. In Tudor England, the king's body was no private matter. It was seen as a mirror of the kingdom's health, a living symbol of God's favor. A strong, vigorous monarch meant divine blessing. A diseased one hinted at judgment. Thus, Henry's decline was more than personal humiliation, it shook the very mythology of monarchy. How could God's chosen ruler reek of death? Some whispered that his afflictions were punishment for the blood of innocents spilled, for the wives discarded and executed. Others feared that to even think such thoughts was treason, and so they kept silent while their king decayed before them. Modern medicine offers chilling clarity. In 1536, Henry suffered a catastrophic jousting accident. Thrown violently from his horse, the king was left unconscious for 2 hours. In an age with no understanding of traumatic brain injury, few grasped its implications, but from that moment, Henry changed. The once affable monarch grew suspicious, unpredictable, consumed by rages that terrified even his closest advisors. Historians today recognize the hallmarks of severe brain trauma, mood swings, paranoia, violent impulses. It is likely this accident marked the true beginning of the monstrous king history remembers. Many believe Henry showed signs of Cushing's syndrome, a hormonal disorder that explains his sudden weight gain, his mood instability, and the ulcers that would not heal. The man who claimed divine right to rule may simply have been the victim of diseases his physicians were powerless to name, much less cure. Yet, in the court of Henry VIII, no one dared suggest the king was ill. To admit weakness in the body of the sovereign was to question the authority of the crown itself, an act that could easily be branded treason. The result was a grotesque charade, a court pretending their sovereign was whole while watching him rot alive. They bowed before him, kissed his hand, and then fled his presence to vomit in private. The mask of majesty remained, but it was slipping. By the end, Henry VIII could no longer control even the most basic of bodily functions. Special chairs followed him from chamber to chamber, for the king could not always trust himself to make it to a privy. His attendants carried cloths not just for ceremony, but to clean their master when accidents occurred. The sovereign who had once embodied the strength of England was reduced to dependency, humiliation, and helplessness. A body betrayed by its own kingly flesh. Everyone knows the refrain. Henry VIII had 6 wives, 2 of whom he executed. But that familiar line hides the true cruelty of his marriages, which were not merely a sequence of unions and divorces, but a theater of psychological torture. To be chosen as Henry's queen was not a blessing, it was a death sentence in slow motion, a gamble in which survival depended on luck, silence, and Henry's unstable whims. Take Anne Boleyn, perhaps the most infamous. History often remembers her as a schemer who rose too high, but the manner of her downfall reveals something darker. Henry did not simply order her death, he staged an elaborate performance of betrayal. Her own musician, Mark Smeaton, was tortured until he confessed to adultery with her, a confession wrung from agony rather than truth. Worse still, Henry made Anne watch as 5 men, including her own brother George, were executed for supposed affairs with her. She was forced to endure the spectacle of innocent men dying in her name, knowing she would be next. Few fates in history equal the cruelty of standing powerless, while your husband destroys those you love to justify killing you. Catherine Howard's tragedy was, in many ways, even more disturbing. Barely a teenager when Henry, nearly 30 years her senior, married her, she entered courtly life already vulnerable. When rumors surfaced of past relationships, Henry responded not with wounded pride, but with legislative vengeance. He pushed through a new law. It was treason for anyone to marry the king without confessing their entire sexual history. Imagine the humiliation an entire kingdom watching as the personal life of a young girl was dragged into public, rewritten into criminality. Catherine Howard's so-called crime was not infidelity, but the audacity of not being untouched before Henry claimed her. She, too, went to the scaffold, her youth no shield against the paranoia of her husband. And then there was Catherine of Aragon, the first queen, married to Henry for over 20 years. Cast aside, when she could not give him a son, she was confined to bleak houses, forbidden from seeing her beloved daughter Mary. Letters she wrote pleading for reconciliation were never read. Some whispered that she was poisoned on Henry's orders, for her death came conveniently at a moment when Henry needed her gone. Whether by neglect or design, she died alone, her faith unshaken but her dignity stripped away by a man who once swore to love her until death. The stories of these women were not exceptions, they were the rule. In Tudor England, queens were pawns in dynastic games. Their value lay in their wombs, their alliances, their ability to secure the line. But under Henry, the rules became more sinister. He rewrote laws to suit his rage, inventing treasons where none existed. His wives were not simply partners in monarchy, they were captives in a gilded cage, where affection could turn to accusation in a heartbeat. It is easy to look back with a detachment of history, to see the portraits and the famous rhyme divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that rhyme cannot capture the terror of waking each day beside Henry VIII, never knowing if you would be showered with jewels or accused of treason. For his queens, marriage was not sanctuary. It was a chamber of fear, a crucible of manipulation, a place where survival itself was uncertain. To be Henry's wife was not to be elevated, but to be ensnared in a web of terror from which there was no escape. If Henry's cruelty was relentless, it was made more unbearable by the fact that it was never constant. He wielded love itself as a weapon, turning affection into a tool of control. One day, a wife might wake to jewels, gowns of silk, and whispered promises of eternal devotion. The next, she might be banished from his sight, left alone in chambers cold with silence, her very life hanging on his mood. This was Henry's most insidious game, to smother with kindness and then abandon without warning, keeping his queens in a perpetual state of dread. Anne of Cleves knew this terror better than most. Married to Henry in a political alliance with the German duchies, she was paraded before him like a prize. But Henry, famously disappointed with her appearance, mocked her in private and humiliated her in public. His solution was not simply divorce but annulment, a declaration that their marriage had never truly existed. Anne, shrewd enough to recognize the peril, submitted without resistance. She signed away her title as queen, calling Henry her beloved brother, and in doing so saved her life. It was the most degrading escape imaginable to pretend that one had never been a wife, only a mistake, but in Henry's court, humiliation was preferable to execution. Jane Seymour's story at first seems gentler, but it is no less chilling. She gave Henry what no other wife had managed, a legitimate son, Edward. For this, Henry exalted her, proclaiming her his true wife. Yet her reward was death, complications from childbirth, tearing her life away just days after Edward's birth. Jane never saw her son grow. Henry's grief was public and dramatic, but not lasting. Within 9 days of her funeral, he was already planning his next marriage. Even the one wife who fulfilled his greatest wish was disposable, her memory set aside as quickly as her body was buried. To Henry, wives were not human partners, but instruments of dynastic ambition and personal gratification. When they pleased him, they were showered with gold. When they failed him, they were cast aside or destroyed. This pattern, while shocking, stood in stark contrast to the norms of European royalty. In France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, royal marriages were indeed political, but they rarely ended with blood on the scaffold. Queens might be marginalized, exiled, or quietly sidelined, but they were seldom treated as enemies to be crushed. Henry's cruelty shocked his contemporaries, for it revealed not just indifference, but a pathological desire to remake the rules of kingship around his moods. Even those who escaped his wrath, like Anne of Cleves, never truly escaped the shadow of his power. They lived in palaces provided by his grace, their wealth and safety contingent on continued obedience. For Henry's queens, love was not comfort. It was a chain sometimes gilded, sometimes sharpened, but always binding. To be loved by Henry was to live in fear, and to be unloved was to court death. In his hands, love itself became the most dangerous weapon of all. Henry VIII was not simply a king, he was an eater on a royal scale. By his later years, he consumed as much as 5,000 calories a day, a diet that would stagger even the strongest body. Where most men of his court nibbled on bread, cheese, and beer, Henry demanded entire tables groaning under the weight of roasted oxen, swans, and venison pies glazed with sugar. His kitchens at Hampton Court were the largest in Tudor England, staffed by over 200 cooks, butchers, and bakers. Fires burned day and night, turning whole animals on spits, while cellars overflowed with wine and beer. Food was not simply sustenance for Henry, it was a display of dominance, a feast staged to remind all who watched that he alone could command such abundance. But abundance came with paranoia. Poison was the great terror of medieval courts, and Henry, increasingly suspicious as his reign wore on, surrounded his meals with elaborate defenses. Every dish was first tested by servants, nothing reached his lips until it had been tasted by another, and then left to sit for half an hour, just in case a hidden toxin revealed itself. Silverware was inspected, cups washed with ritual care. Even his most loyal attendants risked their lives by taking the first bite, for Henry's fear of betrayal extended even into the dining hall. The irony was that his healthy foods often hastened his decline. Tudor physicians advised him to gorge on red meat for strength, to swallow sugared syrups as medicine, to drink wine in place of water. He shunned vegetables and grains as peasant food, unfit for a monarch. Meat became not only his nourishment but his identity, the very symbol of kingly wealth and divine favor. To eat like a king meant to devour flesh in obscene quantities, and Henry embraced this creed with monstrous devotion. At court banquets, the spectacle was unforgettable. Guests dined while watching the king, bloated and sweating, tear into platters of roasted beef, his ulcerated legs barely supporting him beneath the table. The feasts were not only about food, but about theater, a monarch proving his power by consuming the wealth of his kingdom before the eyes of all. Yet the spectacle was also grotesque. As Henry aged, his body decayed even as he gorged, his breath stank, his wounds leaked, and yet he insisted on being seen as the center of a glorious ritual of appetite. Watching Henry eat was watching both power and corruption embodied, a king rotting from within, feeding himself into an early grave. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII no longer trusted his throne or even his own bed. The king who once strode proudly into jousts now lived in a fortress of fear. Crossbows were kept within reach at night, daggers lay hidden beneath his pillows, and guards stood by his chamber doors even as he slept. To be near Henry in his final years was to breathe the air of suspicion, to know that every glance might be misread as treachery. His palaces became labyrinths of defense. Secret passages snaked through the walls, allowing Henry to slip unseen from one chamber to another. Peepholes were carved discreetly into wooden panels, giving him or his spies the ability to watch without being seen. What began as security hardened into obsession. A monarch who could summon armies still lay awake listening for assassins in the shadows of his own palace. This paranoia was not confined to walls and weapons. Henry built networks of informants so dense they sometimes tripped over each other. Courtiers spied on courtiers, servants whispered about servants, and all reported upward, hoping to avoid suspicion themselves. Even whispers of a dream, a rumor, or a passing jest could be twisted into evidence of treason. It was a kingdom devouring itself, each subject fearing that the wrong word might cost them their head. History offers grim parallels. Caligula of Rome, convinced conspiracies lurked everywhere, executed senators for imagined plots. Stalin, centuries later, would order purges based on little more than suspicion, his regime drowning in the blood of the innocent. Henry belonged in this lineage of tyrants, his paranoia turning his court into a theater of fear. Not even his daughters were spared. Princess Mary, his own child with Catherine of Aragon, was stripped of her title and forced to sign documents declaring her mother's marriage illegitimate. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, was declared a bastard too, her very existence a reminder of her mother's execution. For Henry, family was not refuge but another potential nest of betrayal. And so his paranoia consumed everything. Friends, lovers, servants, children. It reached a point where men and women were executed not for what they had done, but for crimes that existed only in the king's dreams. In Henry's England, even the nightmares of one man were enough to send others to the scaffold. To live at the court of Henry VIII was to breathe fear as daily air. Behind the glitter of silks and jewels, every nobleman and servant knew the rules could change overnight. Yesterday's confidant might become today's traitor. A jest whispered at supper could be twisted into treason by morning. Nobles betrayed one another to survive, feeding Henry's paranoia with a steady drip of accusations. Trust, that fragile currency of power, was extinct in Tudor England. For servants, life was no less terrifying. To attend the king was to risk humiliation or death. His meals, once a pleasure, had hardened into a military operation. Tasting, testing, and timing each dish was carried out with the precision of a battlefield maneuver, for any mistake could be mistaken for sabotage. Even lifting a goblet before the king's lips carried the weight of mortal danger. Beyond the palaces, the Tower of London stood as the visible heart of this terror. Its stone walls, already ancient, became the stage for Henry's suspicions. Nobles, clergy, even queens passed through its gates, rarely to emerge again. The tower's shadow fell across every courtier's mind, a reminder that Henry's mercy was as fragile as glass. One misstep, one wrong word, and those same gates could close upon them too. The court became a theater of dread, its actors performing loyalty while silently rehearsing betrayal. Laughter rang hollow, conversation carried hidden traps, and silence itself could be dangerous. Every gesture, every look, every word was weighed against the shifting moods of a single man. By his final years, Henry's paranoia was not confined to chambers or castles. It had seeped into the very fabric of the kingdom. England itself was suffocated by one man's delusions, its nobles and commoners alike caught in the tightening web of a monarch who trusted no one, not even his own blood. By the final weeks of Henry VIII's life, the once magnificent king was reduced to a spectacle of decay. His body, swollen with disease, could no longer carry its own weight. He was hoisted into specially made chairs, his legs wrapped in bandages that did little to contain the corruption beneath. From his ulcerated wounds, flesh sloughed away, and the stench of rot filled the royal chambers. Servants gagged as they worked, traumatized by the duty of cleaning what remained of their sovereign's body. The horror was not only physical but spiritual. Tudor medicine, with its leeches and ointments of herbs and animal fats, had no weapon against infection. Physicians poked and prodded, but their efforts were as futile as they were painful. To Henry's contemporaries, illness was more than biology, it was judgment. Whispers spread that his rotting flesh was a sign of divine punishment, that God himself was condemning the king for the blood he had spilled and the churches he had broken. Even courtiers who dared not speak aloud could not ignore the symbolism. The body of England's ruler was collapsing from within, just as his kingdom trembled under the weight of his tyranny. The deathbed scene was grotesque in its intimacy. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his once commanding voice reduced to slurred demands and feverish mutterings. Attendants approached cautiously, for even in this state, Henry's temper could flare into cruelty. The room stank of pus, urine, and despair, a king transformed into a corpse before his death. And when the final moment came in January 1547, it was not greeted with reverence, but with fear. The attendants hesitated to touch him, unsure if the massive, bloated body was truly lifeless. To lay hands on Henry VIII, even in death, was to risk being accused of impropriety or sacrilege. For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the rattle of a man whose body had become his own prison. Then, at last, the reality sank in. The monster king was gone. Henry had lived as a tyrant, and he died as a horror. His last legacy was not glory or triumph, but the memory of a bedchamber filled with the stench of rotting flesh, a reminder that even kings cannot escape the decay of the grave. Death should have closed the chapter of Henry VIII's nightmare reign, yet even in burial, the king could not escape the grotesque. His corpse, swollen with disease and fluids, was too vast for dignity. As the coffin was borne toward Windsor, the wood strained against the weight. Somewhere along the journey, it gave way. The bloated body ruptured, and fluid seeped through the cracks. Chroniclers whispered of dogs entering the church to lick at the remains of England's once mighty ruler. For a king obsessed with majesty, it was the most humiliating of spectacles, his flesh consumed not by angels, but by strays. Even in the ground, Henry's body brought unease. His tomb was never completed. He was laid in a temporary vault, meant only as an interim resting place. The grave itself seemed to revolt against him. The floor collapsed under his weight, and attendants later swore to hearing unsettling noises near the burial site, creaks, groans, echoes that sounded like the king's restless spirit. In a kingdom steeped in superstition, these whispers took hold. The tyrant could not sleep, even in death. Tudor funerals were meant to display order, divine sanction, and eternal peace. The body of the king was supposed to symbolize the body of the nation, carried with reverence as proof of God's favor. But Henry's burial was the opposite, a spectacle of decay, a ritual undermined by rot. The man who had claimed divine right, who had demanded England bend to his will, was revealed at the end as just flesh, corrupt, foul, and collapsing into dust before the eyes of his people. In this, Henry VIII became a symbol greater than his dynasty. He was the embodiment of power's corruption, a man who devoured wives, subjects, and even his own kingdom, only to be devoured in turn by his failing body. Gluttony, paranoia, and cruelty did not leave behind glory. They left behind a warning. And so his true legacy is not the splendor of his palaces, nor the power of his throne, but the stench of his final days. Henry VIII remains a reminder that absolute power consumes itself, and that kings, no matter how mighty, rot like any other man.